Welcome to this series looking at how to answer the AQA GCSE History questions for Paper 1 Understanding the Modern World. In this video we're going to be concentrating on the source questions and we're going to be looking at America 1920 to 1973. The first thing that you'll see when you open your paper are two interpretations that look a little bit like this. So these two interpretations both talk about President Roosevelt. But the interpretations in your exam this summer could talk about any aspect of the American 1920 to 1973 course. Based on those interpretations, you'll be asked three questions. Now the three questions will always have the same format. How do they differ for 4 marks? Why might they differ for 4 marks again? And which do you find more convincing for 8 marks? So in this video we're going to concentrate on the second question, which is why might the authors of interpretation A and B have a different interpretation? Now once again this is a 4-mark question, so what you need to make sure that you do is that you write one paragraph and that you spend 5 minutes on it. And by asking why might the authors have a different opinion about the interpretation, what the question is asking you to do is to speculate what reasons the authors might have to have either a positive or negative opinion. And for this they want you to focus on a different part of the interpretation. So, unlike the first question, we're going to ignore the information that's written in the box on the source. Instead, we're going to focus on this bit that's written above it, because we want to focus on who wrote it and why they wrote it. So now we're focusing on the right part of the interpretation, we need to ask it a few questions. So the first question is who wrote it? Then when did they write it? And then why did they write it? Which will help us to answer the main question, which is what was the author's purpose? Why did they make this source? What message were they trying to get across? So let's take each of these questions in turn. Firstly, who wrote it? This interpretation was written by John Gates, who we can see was a student in the early 1930s and a member of the Young Communist League, which then suggests that his purpose might have been to either spread the ideas of communism or to criticise capitalist ideas. So then the next question, why was it written? So we know it was written for a book, and the book was called The Story of an American Communist, which suggests that it's an autobiography, which suggests that the purpose was to give an account of what it was like for John Gates growing up as a communist in America. And then, when was it written? And we can see it was written in 1959, which, as we know, was during President Eisenhower's presidency, and perhaps more importantly, was during the Cold War, which suggests that his purpose might have been to give a good account of communism during the Cold War and a negative account of capitalism. And then we move on to interpretation B, and again, we ignore the bit that we used for question 1, and instead we focus on the provenance. So using the same methodology as for interpretation A, we can see that interpretation B was written by a man called Rexford Tugwell. It was written for a book called The Democratic Roosevelt, and it was written in 1957. But again, the key part of this will be thinking about what the author's purpose was in writing this using those 3 questions. So again, we need to focus on the purpose. So the first question, this book was written by Rexford Tugwell, who was an advisor to President Roosevelt and a member of the Democratic Party. As a result, his purpose could have been to show that President Roosevelt's decisions were right. Then the next question, why was it written? So it was written for Tugwell's book called The Democratic Roosevelt, which we can assume was a factual book written about Roosevelt. So his purpose would have been to show Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a positive light. And then finally, it was written in 1957, which is a similar time frame to interpretation A. So we know it was written during the Cold War, and it was written under a Republican president called President Eisenhower. As a result, we can assume his purpose was to show that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies were better not only than the Republicans, but also better than the Communists during the Cold War. So then, before we can write it, we need to know what the mark scheme and what the examiner will be looking for. So what the mark scheme says is that it wants a developed answer which analyses the provenance in order to explain the reasons for difference, which we can think of very simply as explaining why the 2 interpretations are different using who or why or when. So let's have a look at this model answer. So the first thing the model answer does is identify a reason why they're different. So in this case, that they're written by different people. What the model answer then does is it explains, and this is where it becomes developed, why that means they were different by linking to the purpose. The answer then identifies a second reason why they're different, so the time they're written, and then again explains why that's important by linking to the purpose. As a result, this answer would get 4 out of 4. So let's go through the steps to answer this question. So firstly, step 1, identify who, why and when the interpretation was written. And then step 2, you want to write a direct comparison of the two interpretations using one of the questions. So for example, choosing who, you would compare who wrote interpretation A with who wrote interpretation B. So then step 3, you want to explain why that makes them different by linking to their purpose. So just like in the answer previously. And then finally, step 4, repeat steps 2 and 3 for another W question. So if you did who originally, think about doing why or when this interpretation was written. And that's it. I hope you found it useful. Please check back for another video looking at another one of the exam questions.